Hi everybody! So today's video is going to be a condensed version of how I made my latest Victorian corded corset. This corset making is actually the subject of a very in-depth course I am currently creating, so definitely stay tuned for that. This corset was made based on my mock-up from my Tale of Two Corsets video. Okay, so I started out by making some last alterations to my pattern after the mock-up process. Trimming down my paper pattern pieces, tracing them off onto the coutil. And adding my seam allowance. I also repeated this process with the silk panels. And then I cut out all my pieces. And here are some of the silk panels I'll cut out. And here are the silk panels laid out with all the coutil panels. And so for all my coutil panels, I traced around the stitching line for every panel, just for accuracy's sake. And I basted together my silk because I was actually using 2 layers of silk as my fashion layer. And I had to reference the pattern to see exactly where the cording was before I began flatlining my silk to my coutil. So I just marked on the panels where I could begin the flatlining, and there are all my panels flatlined together now. And so it's time to insert the busk. And I'm using a spoon busk for this. So I'm using a facing on the center front panels and stitching that facing in place. And making sure not to stitch in between the placement of the loops. And pressing that seam open. Now it's time to insert the knob side of the busk, but before that I'm finishing the edge of the facing using this fabric tape. And there's the loop side of the busk all inserted. And now it's time to get those knobs through the other side. And so now I'm stitching on the center back facing, adding the center back boning channels, and top stitching around the edge of the busk. And there's one of the center back panels. It's time to add my eyelets. I used 2-piece eyelets for this corset. And there they're all inserted. I used a mallet to set these eyelets. And that's the inside. You can see they're closer together at the waistline. And now it's time for cording. I used cotton yarn for this cording. And I used a narrow zipper foot, and you can see I would first insert my cotton yarn and then stitch down on the other side of it, eliminating the need to drag the cording through the channel after it was stitched. And there's my cording all completed. Now it's time to add these short little pieces of boning into this particular panel right here. Filing those ends smooth. And placing it in the channels. And now it's time to attach all the panels together. So I'm first basting along the stitching line to make sure everything is accurate. And then going ahead and stitching on my machine. And you can see that the seam allowances are actually turned to the right side of the corset, and you'll see the reason for that in a moment. And I'm pressing these seams open over my tailor's ham. And after trimming those seam allowances down now, it's time to add my boning channels over top of those seams. I used a combination of strips of silk as well as woven fabric tape for these channels. You have to make sure that there's no thread sticking out of those seams. And here's the waist tape. So I just pinned it in place, and then this stitching for the boning channels would hold that waist tape down in place. And it's time to add the binding around the edges. I first stitch it on the one side by machine and then by hand. And of course inserting my boning. And finally adding some flossing on the end of each boning channel to hold the strips of boning in place. And finally lacing it up using the bunny ears method. I'm going to be showing you guys how to put on the corset and tighten it. I'm going to talk a little bit about seasoning your corset and getting used to wearing a corset. Okay, so you can see I have the lacing in the back as loose as it will go. That's very important because it's going to be a lot harder to put it on if it's tight. So with this kind of busk, it is a little more challenging to hook up than other busks because it's so rigid. But the key is you just have to start getting one loop hooked up, and then you just focus on one at a time. So I got the first one done up, now I'll do the second one. It's a little challenging here. Okay, well I got the third one. I missed the second one, so 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and then I'll just undo and then redo to get that second one done. Okay, so it's done up now. It might take a little bit of practice, so definitely don't panic if it takes you a long time to figure out how to do this. It definitely took me a long time, especially to get used to a spoon busk. So now it's done up, but of course it's still very loose right now. So it's time to start tightening. So you can use a mirror for this, or you can just go by feel. So I'm going to feel for those bunny ears that we did earlier, and it's just gonna feel like a ridge of lacing that's going straight down. And I'm just gonna start by giving that a tug. And you can see it's mostly tightening right here, but it's not really doing much at the top and the bottom. So this is where you just need to feel up or use a mirror and start with the first X that you can feel. Pull on that, go down to the next X. Now I'm not seeing what I'm doing, so I could be doing this slightly wrong, but it's easier than it looks. So you just keep pulling that slack down until you get to about the height of the bunny ears, and then you can pull that slack into the bunny ears. And then for the bottom, I'd want to make sure that I'm not doing this part up too tight, because the hips do fit me a bit more loosely. That's how I like my corsets to fit. And so the tendency is for them to quickly get too tight, for the lacing to be pulled too tight, that is. So pull the slack upward into the bunny ears. Now, the way that I drafted my pattern is to have about a 2-inch lacing gap. And so I'm going to leave it actually a little bit wider than that because I've never worn this corset before, and both the corset and my body need to get used to it. And that's a very important part about seasoning. Seasoning the corset basically just means getting your corset and your body accustomed to being worn. So now I'm just tying a bow, and there it's on. So based on how this feels, because I did take even more reduction in the waist from my second mock-up, it is fitting pretty snugly. So in all honesty, if I was going to start wearing this around the house now and getting used to it, I would actually do it up even looser than this. But just for the purposes of showing you how to put it on, I'm gonna have it done up. But yeah, you're gonna wanna do it up pretty loosely. You don't want it to feel uncomfortable or tight at all when you first put it on, because you need to get used to it and the corset needs to get used to you. So that's the main part about seasoning, as well as don't wear your corset for longer than like 2 hours the first time, even 1 hour. As soon as you start feeling discomfort or like you've just been wearing it for too long, take it off and take a break. and maybe the next day try it on for a little longer. And that's just how you can have a seamless introduction to corsetry without it being kind of this overwhelming thing where you feel really uncomfortable and then you want to give up on corsetry altogether. So here's the finished corset anyway. I'm super proud with the final result, and I hope you're happy with your final corset as well. Thanks so much for joining me on this corset making adventure, guys. Bye!